Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. I'm super excited today to be talking with Rob Connelly. We met actually on a podcast Facebook group, I think it was, so we've kind of connected in a strange, organic way. So welcome, Rob, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Clint. Really glad to be with you. You never know who you're going to meet.
You never know.
Where or how, so here we are.
It's true. I've met some really good people on some of these podcasting groups on Facebook. And it's funny, though, because a lot of people are ditching Facebook now, aren't they? They're getting off the platform. They're going to Blue Sky and everything else. They're getting off of X. Are you thinking about making a move yourself, maybe, or staying put with Facebook?
I don't know. I mean, it's such a constantly changing landscape. And
It is.
I mean, even all the other social platforms that people utilize, something's banned one day and back the next. And I mean, who knows? At this point, I am where I am, but I'm open to whatever provides the most human connection with people that I can learn from and that I might be able to help. That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, it's a good positive outlook, isn't it? I mean, still Facebook has got something I think that a lot of platforms just don't have. Maybe it's that social connection, like you say. I mean, we've got a podcast Facebook group, and it's a great way to build community, find like-minded people such as yourself. We come out of a similar backstory. I'm sure we're going to get into it, but it's a good way to meet other people. Community is hugely important, isn't it? I mean, especially if you come out of religion or a high control religious group or a cult, you got to find a new tribe. Have you been able to find that? I mean, I know we're going to get into your backstory, but is that helpful being on social media?
Yeah, I mean, I would say other than the predatory, let me sell you a course, let me serve you 1,000 ads that are tangentially interesting dynamic, my own spiritual journey has been greatly benefited by finding out that there are others going through deconstruction, going through divorce, going through spiritual journeys outside of the one little box that I was in for the first 37 years of my life. And so the ability, I'd say this is probably true for the internet in general, the ability to be exposed to people and information that's currently outside of your consciousness is one of the great gifts of the internet, one of the great gifts of social media. Obviously, it comes with negative side effects, as all technologies do. But, I think that is something for which in this season of my life, I've been very grateful.
It is fascinating, isn't it? The power of social media, because I'm over here in the UK, and just maybe a month ago or a few weeks ago, as we're doing this recording now, Elon Musk posted something on X about how the British government wasn't doing enough to curb child sexual abuse and sex trafficking. That caused a firestorm in the UK government. The prime minister was involved. All these politicians were involved. And you think just one post on X by Elon Musk can have that much power over another country on the other side of the planet. And yet this is the world we're living in.
Yeah, and it brings up all kind of questions about the definition of free speech, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And what does it mean to be a truly free human being in the world? And you can't even ask a question without an entire government being offended. And questions of civil religion follow very closely behind. But it is really an intriguing set of ideas that we are grappling with in the Western world these days, and I'm not sure most of us even realize it.
And of course, as we're doing this recording now, within just a few days ago, Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th president of the United States, which is fascinating and intriguing and perhaps scary, depending on what side of the platform you're on. But before we get into all that, let's get into your backstory. I'm curious. You say, okay, you identified yourself as an exvangelical, I think, on this podcast Facebook group. You said something about, I believe you were a Southern Baptist church leader, something like that. So maybe take us through it. Where were you born and raised? Were you born into Christianity? How'd you get out?
Yeah. So I probably would say the title exvangelical is somewhat useful to describe me. Because I am an ex-evangelical. I would probably want to center my sense of self around being on a spiritual journey that is open rather than on what I am leaving. And so, for that reason, I tend to be relatively hesitant about titles, but I think it can be helpful to understand where one's coming from. And for anyone who's wanting to understand what I might be able to offer them in their journey, it is helpful to know certainly what tradition, religious tradition, not only was I brought up in, but my identity was in for 37 or so years. And I talk about identity a lot because identity is really the core theme of my story in journeying through this life 37 and a half or so years as an evangelical Christian. And so I was born in a sleepy little town called Martinsville, Virginia. For any Americans over here on this side of the pond, if you know NASCAR or you've heard of Bassett Furniture, then you know Martinsville, and that's about all we have with a few stoplights and 15,000 wonderful humans. I was born there into a moderate evangelical environment, actually. And my story begins with the first marriages of both of my parents. And they both went through divorce. And as part of their meeting one another and being sort of revitalized by their relationship together, they believed that this was a part of God showing them love, that God's love was the reason that they were able to find each other, and that their participation in the church was very much connected to what it meant for them to love God in return. And so when I was the product of their remarriage and their sort of redemption in life, second phase story, it only made sense for them to have me dedicated into the Baptist church, which I'll get into the technical what that actually is for some of
Yeah, what does that
listeners. They
mean?
may be like, what in the world is dedication? And then as I grew up in the children's programs and the youth programs, going through the process of baptism and genuinely finding, because of the language that was used by my parents and most of the adults that were influential in my life, in the life of the church there, I found my identity as a Christian. I found my identity as a follower of Christ. And there really was no other way for me to view myself that was safe. And so other questions were not welcome. And I would say it's really important distinction for me to say that the church family that I grew up in really did feel a lot like a family to me. And there really was a lot of beauty in that environment. I had, a handful of adults that I knew I could go to that, to the best of their ability, would be a support for me in my life. And there were also some really troubling things that occurred. Pastors that were chewed up and spit out, some church politics things. But on the whole, that was a very loving environment. And so it made it very difficult for me to separate I guess, what I was experiencing that was positive along with the messaging about who I was and what the nature of reality was from any sort of opportunity to question or be on an independent free thinking journey. And of course, this is the story of the world, is it not? I mean,
Mhm.
we're born into the context in which we are born, and the worldview of those around us often is such an encapsulating starting point that it's very difficult for us to wander very far from home.
Mhm. Especially if
And
we're not
so
encouraged to do so. I mean, I'm already resonating with your story because I talk about this in my book. You're in this Christian bubble.
yeah.
It wasn't that they were lying to us. I mean, they firmly believed it was all true. Pastors, parents, trusted adults, mentors, disciple makers, and all the rest of it. But I, like you, I didn't think to question it. And when I had alternative points of view, I would double down, you know, and argue and fight against those things, different theologies and all that. So, yeah, I was a product of that system too.
Yeah, and I just I think there's a really important point right at the crux here, which is that for every one of those people, believing and living out their beliefs was love.
Mm. As they
And
saw it. Yeah. That was
as
their
they
yeah, expression of it.
totally. And I became like them. You know, for me, I wanted to belong to something bigger than myself, and I think we all do.
Yeah.
And
I wanna save the world.
I mean, quite literally believing that people perishing apart from Christ was my responsibility to solve that problem. And so, you know, various twists and turns later, there was a time where I went to seminary a bit later than a lot of people do. I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I was heartbroken every day for the people perishing apart from Christ across the world, and believed that my purpose in being was to carry the message of hope to lost and dying people across the world. And I know we're going to go back and fill in a lot here, Clint, but in my hopeless moment, Jesus wasn't enough.
Mm,
So I found myself hanging from an eighth floor balcony, having literally run aground in my own life at the tail end of being a pastor.
mm.
And no one in my life at the time would have had any idea.
Yeah, that you were that far gone, that far down the road.
I wasn't even aware of it.
Mm,
I wasn't even aware of how truly miserable I was because I became adept at speaking Christianese, shaking the hand. And on some level, it was super genuine. I mean, on some level, I was doing what I believed I was supposed to do and what I believed was good for the people that I was leading and teaching. And yet inside, I was literally dying to the point that I found myself on a business trip because I was bivocational at the end, you know, working a job and being a pastor, having gotten intoxicated by alcohol and no idea how I ended up hanging over this balcony, but it was the faces of my 4 children that woke me up for the 30 seconds that it took for me to pull back over that railing and fall back asleep, until I woke up in my own sweat the next morning, okay? And so the takeaway is that the hope of Jesus that I believed it was my identity to bring to the world wasn't enough for me,
yeah, it wasn't working for you.
right?
It's
This
supposed to work for everybody. Let's go preach the
but
gospel,
but the
but it doesn't work
hierarchy
for us.
involved me,
How ironic.
right? Like, and I was still way too in the whole thing to really unpack the fact that I had hit rock bottom and that my entire sort of way of living was kind of a sham. And it wasn't until my marriage ended, you know, a little over a year after that, my almost 20-year marriage, and the sort of what happened, like how did this cataclysm come to be moment. And then there were a couple of books that were purchased and didn't get purged with all my theological books that popped up in my life 2 or 3 years after the purchase. The Body Keeps the Score,
Mhm.
which
Yep,
helped me
I've
to
read that.
understand what had really happened to my neurological self and how it was I began to live a life I didn't even know or understand. And then The Power of Now, which really helped me to become present within myself, to begin to ask different questions, to find that freedom to be on a spiritual journey that was not dictated to me, to have an identity that was not outsourced to authority outside of myself. By the way, this is the most non-Christian way of approaching anything. Let's talk about the brain and the higher self, which is good.
Mhm.
Okay, so talk about dismantling doctrine. I mean, just by believing that that was a way to heal, I was dismantling the doctrine that had been my identity a short time before. So
Mm.
I tell people that I lost myself in order to find myself, and that's really true.
It's so fascinating. I mean, you know, our again, we're having these parallel moments. You know, I was a pastor for 12 years in Portland and Oregon before we moved over here to the UK. And I can remember, you know, trying so hard. I was doing everything, killing myself, working 70, 80 hours a week, just burning out, literally burning out. And at the time, I was serving God. I was doing all the things I thought I was supposed to do, evangelizing my neighbors and trying to get the people in the church to do the same thing and grow the church numerically, blah, blah, blah. You know, now I look back on it and think, what in the hell, man? You know, And I come to the conclusion now that Christianity just doesn't work as advertised. It's supposed to be this wonderful, amazing thing, but now that I'm an ex-evangelical, I look back, I think, you know, all those years, all those tens of thousands of dollars and pounds spent on these education and going to seminary and everything else, for what? For what? I mean, what did we accomplish? You spent 37 years in this thing. What's your takeaway from it all now?
Yeah, I think the power of well-meaning people to be led astray and lead others astray as a cycle is ghastly.
Hmm.
And I want to focus in on the well-meaning aspect of it because not only in my childhood, but throughout the mentor relationships that I had, throughout the churches that I was involved in, the church that I was a part of in seminary was about as loving and safe a place as evangelical church can be. And yet it was built on this belief that we are inherently bad and have no hope within ourselves. And so that belief, which is not just a theological belief, it becomes a personal belief. It becomes a belief that shapes our consciousness. And so the way it works, and quantum physics backs this up, ancient wisdom traditions back this up. What we believe becomes what we are conscious of. Our beliefs literally build our consciousness, and our consciousness creates our experience. So we literally experience the world through the lens of our beliefs.
Mhm. Yeah, it's filtered, and it's our worldview, our lens through which we interpret events and assign meaning to things and all that.
100%. And quantum physics suggests that we're actually perhaps even creating external things based on what we expect to experience.
Mm, absolutely. Well, think about it. When we were Christians, everything had to have a meaning. What is God doing in my life right now? I mean, get up and share your testimony in front of the church. God showed me this amazing thing this week. And when the terrible things come along, suffering and evil and horrible things, what's the plan here, God? What's going on? The book of Job, you know, desperately seeking answers to all this horrific stuff that's come into his life without any explanation. And he never gets an answer, even at the very end.
Oh man, and this question of the will of God.
Mm.
Uh,
Inscrutable, impossible.
God is good, and everything that happens is both His will and good, and we just got the definition of good wrong, or I'm really confused. And so looking back, the need to justify every occurrence through the theological lens of God's agency in the world
Mm,
and the nature of God. And of course, if we're being really honest, every piece of language that we use limits our understanding and has some limiting or contradictory impact on every conversation we have. The Tao says in the opening statements that by using language to describe the path of spirituality, you have inherently fallen away from that path.
mm,
And so I think even as we're talking about these great theological questions of God's goodness, God's agency in the world, we are so limited by using language, the very language that shapes our minds, of course, um, that we struggle to hit the depth of it to really do it. Now, I believe that, as you said, we create. Looking back, I see that I co-created an experience of reality through the lens of my beliefs that meant that the interpretation of every experience was not only filtered by that belief, but I understand now from studying neuroscience, actually shaped by that belief because the brain and the nervous system is actually a giant prediction machine. So we actually, our sensory organs are being fed more information from the brain than the amount of information being sent back to the brain. So that's how you can have the same conversation experienced completely differently by two people. They literally
mm,
experience the same thing differently. So if we are collectively as the church creating this lens and this sort of predictive co-created machine of experience creation, I mean, it is a runaway train of runaway trains.
mm.
And
Yeah.
so you go back and you go, huh, I remember that moment, and I believed this is what was happening, and this is what the elders said, and this is how we applied scripture, and this is what we prayed for, and this is how we grieved, and this is how we, and I go, I don't think I understood what was going on at all.
You had an explanation though, or the ultimate answer, well, Rob, we're gonna find out someday in heaven. We don't know why this happened, but someday we'll get that answer. Like you said, or Christianese. I've been thinking as you've been talking about, there's another point of view we could bring into this whole conversation, and that is the whole cult psychology aspect of it. Because I'm a big fan of Robert J. Lifton. I don't know if you've read his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, but that book changed my life because he talks about, he has 8 markers of cults, going back to brainwashing in communist China and all that. But he talks about not only the 8 markers of cults, but the psychological effect, which is what you've been describing, of each one. So you come into this system and he talks about you enter into a system that's bigger than yourself. You're going to change the world, save the world, whatever the mission is of the organization. You're brought in, you're love bombing and mystical manipulation, milieu control, and all these sorts of things. Then the loaded language, which is what you talked about, Christianese. When you don't understand something, you just take refuge in this loaded language, thought terminating cliches. There's so many things you can bring in and say, well, was it a cult? I don't know, but it's certainly a cult-ic in a lot of ways, cult-like. I mean, would you say that based on your experience looking back on it now?
Absolutely, and I think there is a control variable
Hmm.
that is unconsciously sort of, recycled throughout the generations of disciples. And what I experienced myself was, there were specific pastors and leaders that in using specific language that, whether they were conscious of it or not, placed me in a position of needing to do what was being taught in order to feel as though I was not being sinful or rebellious.
Mhm.
One particularly abusive pastor that actually, oversaw the nuptials in my first marriage and the early years of that marriage and early impressionable years, college years for me, would use language of loyalty to coerce individuals into specific actions. And, the worst of it was, going door to door sharing the message of salvation. I mean, you wanna talk about being manipulated. If you didn't show up for Saturday morning sharing, you weren't really a follower of Jesus. You were just loyal to me, the pastor, and to Jesus. And so,
Yeah, you're letting everybody down, the whole team.
oh my goodness gracious. And if you believe your identity is in actually following through with what Jesus has called us to do, there ain't no room to ask questions, man.
Mm.
This is urgent.
Yeah, well, you're literally saving the world. In just a few minutes, we'll be right back in the second half of this excellent chat with Rob Connelly. In fact, speaking of Rob, we got some really good news. We are going to have Rob coming back in just a few weeks as this episode drops. The 23rd of February, he is going to be our guest in the next Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom call, which starts at 8 p.m. As I say, that's on the 23rd of February. I'm really excited to get back together with Rob. We are going to be talking about religious trauma syndrome, something we get into a little bit in this episode. He's kind of a specialist helping people recover from religious trauma, religious abuse, things like that. One of the things about Rob, we talked about, I think, in this episode so far, he was a musician. He was a worship pastor for a long time. Now he still does music. And in fact, at the very end of this show, I'm going to be playing a song by Rob that's an absolutely fantastic song. And on that Zoom call at the end of the month, Rob's going to be doing like a mini concert. So he's going to bring his guitar along. You'll be able to hear some of his original music. That is a fantastic benefit for joining the Dismantling Doctrine podcast Patreon community. You get access to these wonderful calls that we have. Last month, we had Lauren Axelrod, and that was a great call. We talked about interspirituality. What does all that mean, especially now in the new Trump administration? If you've got friends, family members who are way gone into the MAGA Trump cult, can you even speak with them? And we talked a lot about that on the call. How does spirituality resonate with that? This is something that I'm really getting fascinated by, not necessarily be going back into religion, but looking at spirituality and sort of becoming more of a holistic person. So talking with guys like Larry Jordan and Lauren Axelrod and some of the other people I've had on the show toward the end of last year, it's really opened my eyes to some really interesting realities. So just something to be mindful of, something to be aware of, this issue of spirituality, which of course can be so triggering for those of us that have come out of high control religious groups, cults, whatever. We don't want to have anything to do with anything quote unquote spirituality, but there's a lot of aspects to it. And I think it's really an interesting thing. The other thing is I was going to mention what's coming up here on the show. I have an interview coming up with Tim Mills, the harmonic atheist. That's going to be dropping right after this one with Rob Connelly. I actually switched the episodes. Tim's was going to be up next, but because we have this podcast call with Rob coming up, I wanted to get this episode out so you'd get a chance to hear his story a little bit and maybe want to connect with him at the end of February on that call, get to meet Rob for a little bit. And as I'm doing this recording right now, I just literally got off a Zoom call with Austra Putnina. We're going to be doing a crossover episode, and I'm really excited about that because I've done that before on a few other shows. One half is going to be on her podcast, and then the other half will be on the Dismantling Doctrine podcast. So we'll do 2 recordings in part 1 and part 2. So look forward to that coming out after the episode with Tim Mills, the harmonic atheist. And then just one last thing before we get back to Rob, I want to mention if you haven't gotten a copy of my book, which is called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work, that is available on Amazon. You can get it as a paperback, as a Kindle, and just for a little bit more, you can get the Audible AI voice version. So there's a number of different ways you can get a copy of it. Also, if you do pick up a copy of the book, please do me a favor, leave me a good review on Amazon, which helps greatly with its ranking. And I'm working right now on writing the sequel to that book. I'm hoping to have that out this year, sort of a part 2 where that book left off. So I'll be talking more about that as well. And I'm hoping to do a recording soon of one of the chapters in Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People. So look for that coming up also. All right, let's get on back into this conversation with Rob Connelly. And again, don't forget to listen out for, at the very end of the episode, we are going to conclude with one of Rob's original songs. Let's continue exploring this question: what happens when Jesus isn't enough? Well, you keep coming back to that issue of identity. I mean, this is something I talk about a lot in my book, that when I read about Robert J. Lifton's, this concept of what he calls doubling, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, but basically those of us that were in a religious environment, we create 2 selves, 2 identities. One is our religious identity. The other is our actual self, our true identity. What happens is the longer we're in this group and under those controls that you talked about, your religious self suppresses your authentic self, and your authentic self gets lost in the mix somewhere, and it's all about the religious self. And I think, my God, I mean, so much of my life, I was the religious person. That really wasn't who I was. I was wearing a mask, and I'm now, since I left the faith, I'm discovering my authentic self. Would you resonate with that journey at all?
Absolutely. I think the deceptive element for me was how little of the doubled self I allowed expression.
Your
Um,
authentic self.
yeah, so it was there. It was absolutely there. It was running in the background, and I would see moments of it when, for example, my wife at the time might travel out of town, or there was somehow a little piece of space where I could like not be observed for long periods of time. And that's where it would, like, poke its head around the corner and be like,
Hello, Rob.
"Oh, there's something you're not really listening to inside." And unfortunately for me, it began to find itself, um, sort of, with a 3rd layer, which was unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Mm,
From the amount of religious abuse, relational abuse, general traumatization that I had been through and the traumatic adaptations, there was a need to numb and medicate behind the religious curtain. And so that practice of those unhealthy coping mechanisms sort of took on a life of its own, which is related to how I ended up hanging from an 8th floor balcony, being on a business trip, right? And so the incongruence, the complete disconnect of what anybody that knew me thought I was versus what was actually going on under the surface. It was like, there's a mountain erupting from underneath the ocean, and then it's a whole continent,
mm.
and now it seems like there's an entire planet that was there the whole time.
Things shoved under the water.
Absolutely, and being able to love myself as I have been reconciling these sort of converging parts of me, and being able to be at peace with mistakes that I made, behaviors that I don't agree with, that are not actually a part of the values that I've learned how to discover for myself, as well as healing and unpacking the religious abuse and the other forms of traumatic adaptation that came as a result of that, have required literally leaving all of those Christian doctrines and former beliefs about myself in the rearview mirror, just leaving them somewhere else,
Mm.
because there would be a repeated cycle of self-hatred and a need to outsource any form of love I would allow myself to experience, which of course is the root of the whole problem.
Yeah, it's a vicious circle, isn't it? Yeah, I can remember same kind of thing, unhealthy coping mechanisms. Something that really hit me was when I read Marlene Winnell's book, Leaving the Fold. She talks about when we were Christians, when we were evangelicals, every time we had a doubt about the Bible, the faith, our theology, God, whatever it might be, she said, that's actually your authentic self. Like you said, that little voice, little head poking around the corner. That was our authentic self saying, hey, hang on a minute. This doesn't add up. But what we end up doing, I can remember so many times having those crisis of faith moments. I would go to a trusted mentor, a friend, a disciple, someone who discipled me, a pastor or someone like that. And he or she would talk me down, talk me off the ledge and explain it all away. And I would go back in 100%, you know? And so you push that cognitive dissonance down. But eventually, this is a thing they talk about putting stuff on the mental shelf every time you have a problem, like the shelf behind you. You put too many books on that shelf, too much weight, eventually it's going to collapse. And what happens then? A lot of people walk away and never go back. So I don't know. Was it a sudden moment for you, or was it like a long journey of getting out?
It was stages for me.
Mm,
The church that I was pastoring, actually, I planted that church in my hometown. And I'd like to discuss before we're done the role of civil religion in the Bible Belt in my story as well, because it's a huge layer. And I
the
think some of
Bible
your
Belt. You were in the
maybe
buckle of the Bible Belt, sounds like.
I was in the heart of it. I think some of your listeners may be able to resonate with the power of civil religion,
Oh, yeah.
and the layer of confusion that adds. But for me, it was a staged sort of process, and that moment where my marriage was falling apart, and I began to need answers about who I had become. And I went places such as the 2 books that I mentioned, and began to open myself to a broader spiritual sort of questioning path, and understanding that the answers of Western medicine and the religious identity that I had been brought up in, and had assumed and even doubled and tripled down on through my adulthood, simply had not kept me from the lowest points of human misery. Um, and so it was over time, the pandemic was happening concurrently with this, and the sort of general suffering around me, and the human disconnection, and the distrust of authority, and the new conversations that were happening, online, again in social media context. There were a lot of things really that kind of collected with me, before I realized I went back to church after almost 2 years of never darkening the door, and I'm just like, "How was I ever a part of this?"
Yeah, it can be very triggering.
I mean,
Yeah, for
I'm hearing the
decades.
words that I spoke, and my higher self is like, "Bruh,
Get out.
like,
Run.
this was you, and you are not that." And, that clarity, of how I experienced that particular church, that particular morning, and everything that I know, because I have a bachelor's in philosophy and religion from a secular school, and so I studied all the world's religions and a lot of Western philosophy, which is amazing that I then became a fundamentalist and tripled down
Mm,
on all of the things, right? And then I ended up going to a Southern Baptist seminary where I got a master's of divinity. And so the framework for religious inquiry, and to be able to evaluate arguments, and yet then go whole hog in on a particular ideology that is biblical inerrancy, salvation by faith alone through Christ alone, the primacy of the local church, the primacy of the universal church, these sort of doctrines that are very exclusionary and function in a very controlling way. to be at a place where I could walk into an environment like the one I created for others and go, "Oh, hell no." And then be okay with that and be like, "It feels really good to say no to this."
Exactly. It shows how far you've come, isn't it? I mean,
But
that's
it
the
was shocking. It was
yeah,
like, "What's up?"
it's a real jarring moment, isn't it, when you have those encounters? Because I can remember one of the best pieces of advice I got was from with John Atack. He's a former Scientologist, and he said the best thing I can tell you how to chart your own your journey out of religion. He said find someone who's never been religious in his or her life, explain what you used to believe to that person, and watch carefully the expression on their face. And the expression and the what they're going to tell you is will tell you everything about how loony some of the stuff that we used to believe. And I've done this with people, and it is a jarring experience when you actually articulate. I used to believe this, that, and the other thing, and they it just dumbfounded looks on their face, and they're just, wow, that was you. I don't even believe that was you.
No, it's crazy. But I have found, that there's a lot of peace that actually generates the functional hope that I always thought I was giving through the gospel message, and that I actually was able to rely on at my low moments and through the early stages of my healing journey and on the low moments that come in my daily life now. And that peace comes from within, and it comes from being able to sit with myself, being able to own my own shit,
Mm,
being able to see my imperfection, but my goodness, being able to actually love me and being me, which was something that was never allowed in the previous worldview system. And I really strikingly had no idea how much the theological doctrinal beliefs were being lived out in my own view of myself and the experiences that I was creating within my life to keep me in that place of subservience to the power brokers and to the systems and really just I'm a poor little pauper, please can I have a
yep.
little approval and maybe you
Throw me a bone.
I'm a good follower of Jesus today, and my entire identity was a controlled identity, and it
Yeah.
was the
Well,
identity of a pauper.
that's it. If you start out with the assumption, the theological assumption that we're lost, horrible sinners bound for hell, God saved us, whether or not you're a Calvinist or an Armenian or whatever. But, and this is something Lifton talks about. When you get involved in a church, let's say, for example, there's two markers of cults. One is what he calls the cult of confession or the demand for purity, which is then followed by the cult of confession. So they lay a standard on us that's impossible to achieve, whether it's from the Bible, their own teachings or whatever. And then when we inevitably fail, they say, well, you need to get involved in an accountability group. Confess your sins to one another. That's what the Bible says. And you shall be healed. And iron sharpens iron and all that stuff. And I was a part of that. I don't know if you were. I'm sure you were.
Yes.
You know, we fail, we fail, we fail, we beg and we ask for forgiveness. We get involved in accountability groups and we somehow never seem to measure up to that standard. It's this degrading cycle that just goes on for years and decades. And then you get into things like religious trauma syndrome and all that. So yeah, it's a toxic mess.
It's there, and now I help people with religious trauma sort of begin to understand the impact and heal from it and to
Mm,
find that path within themselves, and it's one of the most rewarding things, because everybody's path's a little different, the path they've walked and the path ahead. So, I always say that the best coach or helper that you can find is just somebody who also is on the path, who might be a little bit further ahead of you, that is trustworthy and always redirects you back to yourself and your own path. And so, this idea of a discipler or, somebody that sits on high and proclaims to you, follow me as I follow Christ. This idea that we need to find one who we can attach ourselves to so that, we can find an sort of like an underpath underneath that person's path, underneath the Lord Jesus Christ, so that, you know, who, people come to me out of high control religion and they want me to tell them how to do it.
Mm.
And I'm like, this is trauma lesson number one. You actually know the way. Um, and it is restoring your ability to know that you know the way. That is, really the work that I help people do. And from there, it's like, you don't need me anymore. Fly, baby bird, get out of the nest.
Yeah,
At the
push
end
them
of the
out.
day, like just learning to trust your own compass and not be so triggered by your own inner voice, your higher self speaking to you, because it's so contradictory to what you have believed. And the wiring is still in your brain, the wiring is still in your body, along with the wounds that exist. Right.
Absolutely.
So many of us are
It's
so angry that
Oh,
we
yeah.
stay in fight or flight and we stay triggered, that we mostly just exist as what we're not. We don't exist present with ourselves, learning and being what we are. And
Yeah. It's hard to
I
get out of that.
I love that place, that moment when someone actually tastes of themselves and it's good.
To steal some biblical metaphors. Well, that's something, just speaking the other day with my friends Conway and Siegelman. I mean, they've done so much work on cults and religious right, Christian right. One thing that he said that really struck me, he said, when you come out of these high control religious groups, especially the Bible, sort of fundamentalist Bible cults and Bible groups, he said there's two things that make it harder to recover, and that is the intensity and the duration that the things we were exposed to, things like praying, chanting, speaking in tongues, Bible memorization, things like that. We were steeped in that culture, and it makes it so hard, as you say, neurologically and psychologically and all those other things, to break those cycles and break those molds. I find myself even now, decades later, thinking something bad happens, I need to pray. And there's that instinctive, just gut wrenching thing like, oh, no, I'm not going to pray. I don't need to. I have my own sense of agency. I can make my own decisions. I have to deal with the consequences of my decisions. And that's part of the being an adult, isn't it? But
Mm.
I don't pray. I don't seek God's guidance. I don't go to the pastor. I don't ask someone to disciple me, And so, like you say, you can track your progress, I think. Have you found those kind of similar experiences as you've gotten out?
Yeah, I mean, I found in my stages, and this journey is a lifelong journey. Of course, we never get to the place where we can plant our flag. We've arrived. We're all good to go. But I have found that I have such a distaste for the former programs that I'm almost now triggered by the thought of them being familiar. So that sort of idea of something bad has happened. Okay, God, wait a minute. This is offensive.
Mm.
Like, it's like someone put unauthorized software on me and it's
Yeah, there's
running,
a virus in there.
right?
Trojan horse.
And so, like, for me, I utilize consciousness expansion to literally reprogram the way that my mind and brain interact with the world around me and how I connect with my higher self. That is one area that once I learned that tool of consciousness expansion, I delved very, very deep into those things because I was so angry all the time. I was angry that I wanted to pray, or I was angry that I wanted to listen to a worship song, or I was angry thinking about, because I'm still a musician. I was a worship pastor for a while. That all of my music that I made for 20 years was in this cult that was helping reprogram other people. I'm now making my own
Yeah.
music.
You were part of the
And
problem.
I actually have a few published songs, and it's a big part of me being authentically me. And a couple of them that are getting ready to be released in the next 6 months are deconstruction oriented
Mm.
songs. But the idea that all of that is still in me was so intolerable that it was one of the first things that I sought in my healing journey was a tool set to systematically eliminate them, um, because they were so angering to me that it was causing me to be dysregulated in my nervous system on a regular basis, and I was really having trouble healing.
Mm. That's a fascinating journey. I mean, we need to get into religious trauma syndrome and all this. That we're running out of time, though. That's the problem. I knew we were going to have a good organic conversation. I'm thinking maybe if you're interested, would you be interested in coming back and being a guest? We do every month. We do these dismantling doctrine podcast Zoom calls where people come in. It could be a number of people on the call. You get a chance to spend an hour with people. So I think it'd be wonderful if you'd be up for coming back. Then we can, continue this conversation on that Zoom call with a group of people.
Yeah, Clint, I would love that. I mean, there's so many things we touched on today that, could have received their own, 30, 40-minute time
Oh,
slot.
absolutely.
But I think, first of all, thank you for having me on the show at all, but inviting me back to do more discussion around this religious trauma aspect and the work that I do that's based on the work that I did for myself. And I just, would like to leave us maybe with the following cliffhanger or sort of starting point for people, and that is the number one most dangerous doctrine, in my opinion, is this idea that you're bad and you can't be trusted.
Mm,
Um, and once you fix that navigational beacon, and it's not as simple as just, I don't believe this anymore. It really requires a lot of somatic work and a lot of intentionality and patience and love with yourself and choosing in the moment by moment basis to release the old programs, to identify the triggers that are causing you to cycle back into them, to walk away from people and situations and music and whatever the case may be. Um, but there is a lot of hope and peace that is contained within you once you learn that that doctrine is false, and it is.
mm. We need to dismantle that one too. This is something I think you're right. There's always a concept of having to deal with triggering and issues from our past because I've realized probably in the last couple of years as I'm getting older, it's like I spent all my adult life either in academics and or ministry, full-time ministry, only to walk away from it all. Okay, I got a PhD. So what? It's not worth the piece of paper it's written on. Literally, it isn't. It's my girlfriend says it's a degree in nothing. It really is. I can't get a job at McDonald's with a PhD, and I think, God, I get so angry sometimes, like you said, "What the hell am I doing? What the hell did I spend all those decades for what? I've got nothing to show for it other than some letters after my name," and this is now another thing that I've gotta deal with. I don't have a retirement package like if I'd have just had a job for 30, 40 years or something like a career. So we have to deal with these things as life goes on. They're never fully resolved, are they? It seems like there's always another thing around the bend.
Well, for those of us that, like you, have a career investment into a ministry context and is not only not relevant, but is offensive to us, it is
Exactly.
it is a real struggle, and I would just, contradict you on one thing, my friend, and that is you have a lot to show, and, this podcast is, honestly a really beautiful human thing
Mm,
that you do, that you were equipped to do through a
that's true.
path that feels like a waste, but you are a light. I'm gonna go ahead and borrow some more language. You are a light in a dark place, and what you do with asking these questions about doctrine in a free thinking way is in and of itself a really beautiful purpose. So if you'd allow me to say that, I think it's important.
Yeah, I do appreciate that, and I've said that many times because a couple of years ago, my girlfriend said that to me. She said, "When are you gonna quit doing this podcast? I mean, haven't you basically said it all already? You've said everything there is to say now." And I said, no. I mean, I'm very passionate about that. And like I say, you said, having this background in theology, both of us now, we can speak the language. We know what they're talking about when they say the things, the Christianese, quoting Bible verses and theology. So we can delve into that world. Doesn't mean we're still a part of it. But yeah, it does give us a unique advantage, I think. So I appreciate that. It's a good perspective. But I was going to say, you also do a podcast. Let's talk about what that podcast is and how can people get a hold of you if they want to connect with you on social media.
Yeah, so you can find me by my name on social media. You can find my music anywhere you buy music using my name. You can go to robconnelly.net and find out about the coaching and speaking and the music that I do. And then there's another side to me. I'm part of a movement to bring a completely different set of values to the work world, and that's where my podcast is focused. It's called the Human Centric Business Podcast, and it's getting ready to launch here in February of 2025 with a really interesting topic, talking about being burned out
Mm.
and what it looks like to recover from burnout while you still got to pay your bills. But all of these same healing ideas and what it means to be a human being, and at the core of it, what do I believe about myself really is the core issue in the work world, just like it is in religious trauma recovery.
Very cool. Yeah, you got a lot of irons in the fire. I mean, I can resonate too. I'm thinking someday if you ever come over to across the pond, we'll jam. I play the drums, so that would be good to get, some music in. In fact, we got band practice tomorrow as we're doing this recording, which is really, really good. Looking forward to that. I call it rock and roll therapy. It's one of them things that's helped me recover. Like you said, music is so powerful. And I spent years playing on worship teams. I played in Christian metal bands for years out of Seattle. I was part of that movement, back in the 80s and 90s, trying to make it big as a rock star and all that, for God,
Yeah.
jamming for Jesus. We're going to reach the world like Stryper and all the other big bands, that was our dream. And now I've obviously picked that back up and I love playing. And when I finish a gig, it's like no other feeling, is it? Where you just have that reaction, the crowd, the energy that comes off, you come off, you're on a high. And it's a profound, I don't know if it's a spiritual moment, but it's incredible. So I encourage people to find those things that give them that feeling, that rush, that being in the moment is hugely powerful, especially after if you've left religion behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was a worship pastor and a worship team member almost 20 years, and co-wrote some worship songs and was involved in the technology side. And with everything that I know now, I recognize that the co-creation of an experience of spiritual connection is a super powerful thing that does not require broken beliefs,
Mm,
and we can actually have that beautiful experience in ways that are pro-human, that don't enculturate and program bad beliefs into people, don't create power and control dynamics, and actually create freedom. And so
mm.
I, like you, am right in it and love it.
Good stuff, man. Well, let's continue the conversation. I will hit you up with some dates and we can figure out when we can do this next Dismantling Doctrine Zoom call. But thank you so much, Rob. I've absolutely enjoyed meeting you. This is definitely not the last time we're going to talk. So thank you. Take care. Have a great day, and I will speak to you soon.
Thanks, Clint. Really appreciate the opportunity, man.
As long as I can remember, I was to blame. Broken and hopeless, dangerous and lame. The one who made me ashamed. But I no longer fear his name. If I'm so bad that he had to die, then why am I here? Why even try? Now I'm living my truth instead of a lie. And deep in myself I know the reasons why. It's a Good Friday within myself, 'cause today I know I'm good. I'm choosing love and light in the way that's right. I don't need to be saved. The guilt and the sadness I've always held dear, from the songs that we'd sing and the words that we'd hear. The goodness of me is finally clear, and I'm breaking free of self-hatred and fear. It's a Good Friday within myself, 'cause today I know that I'm good. I'm choosing love and light in the way that's right. I don't need to be saved. The story doesn't even make sense. Your creation rebels, so you kill your son to save it. How can I even believe if I have to deny myself? Unlike Eve, I'm so glad I'm free of that greed. I'm so glad I no longer believe. It's a Good Friday. It's a Good Friday. It's a Good Friday. It's a Good Friday. It's a Good Friday within myself, because today I know I'm good. I'm choosing love and light in the way that's right. I don't need to be saved. I said I don't